Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. In November 1970, Charles Manson was sentenced to death for the horrifying and cold-blooded murders of 7 people near Los Angeles. His sentence was later reduced to life imprisonment after California abolished its death penalty. In Manson's trial, lead prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi spun the story of a demonic cult leader who hypnotized people to commit murder. He published his theory in Helter Skelter, the best-selling true crime book of all time. When author Marlin Marynick was 8 years old, he discovered a beat-up copy of Helter Skelter. The book's portrayal of Charles Manson was an icon of unbridled evil, haunted Marynick for years, well into his career as a psychiatric nurse. So when a chance conversation with a man selling Manson memorabilia on the Internet facilitated a connection to Manson himself, Marynick went along for the ride. This happenstance journey introduced Marynick to Manson's closest confidants, eager to share Manson's story, his talent, his passion, and his philosophy. The adventure crescendoed through Marynick's phone conversations with Manson and ultimately culminated when the two met behind the tightly locked doors of California's Corcoran State Prison. Charles Manson now is a critical dissection of what happened 41 years ago when the Manson family dominated and stormed the Polanski estate and murdered 5 people, among them one of America's most beautiful, beloved actresses, Sharon Tate. This book is also a collage of Manson's own writing, a poetic, ironic, and disturbing account of his universe from his childhood to his time in the 8 by 12 prison cell where he is condemned to stay for the rest of his life. With my special guest, Marlin Marynick, with his book, Charles Manson Now. Welcome to the program, and thank you to agreeing to this interview, Marlin Marynick.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Happy to be here.
Thank you very much. Now, I guess what everybody might ask after they listen to this is, how on earth did you come to get in correspondence with Charles Manson, and why?
It's one of those things that I think if anyone set out to do, and thousands of people have, you can't really get anywhere. So just by dumb luck, if you want to call it that, and a weird sequence of events and coincidences, everything just kind of fell together. So what the short version is, basically, I had a friend who had known Manson since the 60s, before the crimes had happened. They kept in touch over the years, and throughout his time in prison and stuff. And through that relationship, an inmate named Kenny Callahan got a hold of my address. A lot of people, because Charles Manson is such a famous inmate, a lot of other inmates will take his mail, and they call it phishing. They'll try to get outside contacts and try to get stuff like stamps or money, whatever kind of relationships they can form. And so through this Kenny Callahan guy, I started a relationship with him, and he told me that, once Charlie got out of the hole, he would have Charlie phone me. And I didn't think this was real, of course. I thought, well, whatever kind of thing. And at the time, Charles Manson was in the hole. He had fashioned a knife out of an arm brace that one of the other inmates had, and, having I guess it would be called a prison shank or whatever. So having a weapon like that is a very serious offense, and he was thrown in the hole for a year. And when he got out, he called.
So that was how many months after you had this conversation? Sorry?
I'd been dealing with Kenny probably for about 3 months before that happened, 3 or 4 months.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And tell us about the first opportunity. Tell us just more about you had this opportunity, finally got out of the hole. Tell us a little bit more. Continue with what occurred in this correspondence, and tell us a little bit more about that.
When I started talking to Charlie, his whole focus has always been around the environment, and I remember talking about insects and birds and crows and that kind of stuff, the ocean, and his whole focus is trying to save the air, and he calls it ATWA, which is an acronym that stands for air, trees, water, and animals, and so I kind of got adapt to his philosophy and his way of thinking, and because I was in Canada, he thought that maybe there was a way that I could bring in a camera crew and we could do this final address. He had this idea of doing one final interview, and he wanted to make it a statement. So his vision of this was to dress up like a general and command all the armies in the world to stop fighting each other and start fighting pollution. And so that was kind of what kind of bonded us in a way, and kind of helped form the relationship, was his focus on trying to get this interview to happen.
Now, I mean, obviously you weren't fascinated with him as an environmentalist when you were young, or at some point when you had this correspondence, but take us even back. I thought it was very fascinating you described when you first saw the book Helter Skelter, and obviously that would be your first exposure to the story, and what you got from it, what your impressions were, and give us that whole scenario. Where were you? What were the circumstances that you came upon this classic true crime book and first encountered the personality of Charles Manson, at least through this perspective?
Yeah, when I was writing the book, I had to go back and try to figure out what was my earliest remembrance of Charles Manson, and that was through Helter Skelter, and I'm sure it's like that for most people. And so when I was a kid, I found a copy of the book, and I found it in an abandoned house. We used to play in those when I was a kid. We used to rummage around in those kind of places and stuff. And I remember the imagery and the blood writing on the walls, and I remember his eyes and that intense look. And it was I would have been about 8 years old or so, and the whole thing was very horrific. The guy gave me nightmares. So he was a kind of a monster from my childhood. That's kind of my earliest remembrance of him.
How important was that book? I mean, did you just see it? You were affected by looking at it, but I mean, 10 years old, some of these things might be hard to comprehend. Was it a book that was still important? Did you read it again? I mean, what did you get out of the book other than here was the portrayal of this monster? Did you get anything else from the book, either at that young age or a little bit earlier, later on?
Well, when I was exposed to that, I come from a dysfunctional family. My father was an alcoholic, and my mother completed suicide, and so I think that kind of, in a way, opened up a whole world of weirdness for me, and I've always been attracted to kind of darker, odder, stranger kind of things and subcultures, and I think that was kind of how I got interested in that as a child. It was something that was kind of forbidden and maybe taboo in a way, and I don't even, back then, I don't remember hearing the term serial killers or having any, there was no reference other than that book, and oddly enough, all of that kind of experience transpired into a career in psychiatry, and that's what I've been doing for the last 15 years. And so, to me, I was more interested in the psychological kind of aspect of Manson than anything else. That was fascinating, and I think that was ingrained very early, from my childhood. And then every once in a while, growing up, you'd see glimpses of him on TV doing different interviews. I remember seeing the Geraldo thing and the different parole hearings, where you see that, where he's acting out or whatever, that kind of stuff. And so it's kind of progressed, and he's always kind of been in the background. It's always kind of been there.
But you must have had some preconception, or you must have had some conclusion I mean, I'm going to ask you later what your conclusion was after having a correspondence and a friendship or a relationship of sorts with Charles Manson. But did you have any? Because what I'm alluding to is when I talked in the description of the book, you used the word spun. Bugliosi spun. So I mean, I don't have to be. I'm reading between the lines, but they're very, very obvious. You know. What we're alluding to, for those people that don't really know, is, if you could explain what we're really alluding to, and if there is any controversy about Charles Manson, is certainly not that he was, powerful, charismatic. He affected everything from that point on. It became a true crime classic because it did attract people. The story was profound. Sharon Tate, Roman Polanski, Hollywood, hippies, drugs, sex. So it had all those elements, and it had distorted, because they didn't get the facts right away. Of course, rumor and gossip and everything went international. So tell us really, in your mind, before we get too far for our audience, what in your mind is controversial about Bugliosi, the author, but also the prosecutor of Charles Manson, in terms of what Manson is believed to have done and what you think he... Okay. Just explain for us, please.
I guess in the beginning, like before, I totally believed the Helter Skelter version of events. I mean, I had no reason to question it. It was, a huge book, and the way Manson was portrayed and the way he carried himself, it all seemed to fit. I always struggled with the whole concept of mind control, though, and being interested in psychology and those kind of things. It's something I've kind of delved in a little bit, and that really didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And there's been similar kind of things. I remember, like in the 80s, when bands like, I remember Judas Priest had to go to trial because one of their fans had completed suicide, and it was this music's doing that, and somehow if you played something backwards, it said something. And I think Ozzy Osbourne went through a similar kind of a thing, and so it was this whole thing about secret messages and what things really mean and who's controlling what, and that's kind of been a fascinating thing for me. And so that was, when I kind of got immersed in this and decided to write a book, and when all that was kind of coming together, and I did research around that. That was one of the issues I had to go into, was could this really happen, kind of thing, and so that was kind of the first thing that kind of, I would say, broke down a little bit, because, I mean, if you look at those events back in 1969, what was happening, like everyone's on drugs. There's a lot of, there's a lot of chaos and stuff. And if you go into Charlie's life, and I haven't actually talked to him about any of this, but this is just what people tell me and what I remember and what's kind of in the Helter Skelter version of things. So you got a guy who has been in jail the majority of his life. He gets out right in the heart of the hippie movement, and he's kind of like a transient hobo kind of a character, and all of a sudden he's welcomed in. There's these communes, and there's these hippies, and there's free sex, and there's drugs, and there's party, and he delved into that full on. He was a huge part of all of that, and he was initially he wanted to be a musician. That's what Creepy Carpus taught him how to play guitar from the Mal Barker gang, which I think is another Canadian connection. And so he really thought he had something and he could do this music thing. And so he got out, and he ended up being associated with the Beach Boys and writing a couple songs with them. He was friends with Neil Young. He told me that Neil Young gave him a motorcycle once. Frank Zappa, Jim Morrison. He said Jim was a good kid. He was trying to do his own thing. The Byrds. Like all of those people, he was, one of those kind of musicians. And then all of a sudden things start falling apart, and you have a guy who's getting messages from the Beatles record, the Beatles. He believes he's Jesus Christ. He thinks there's a pending race war happening. He's paranoid. He goes and hides out in the desert. He starts digging a hole to the center of the earth or whatever. Like that sounds like some serious mental health problems. It doesn't add up. And then you look at these people are all petty thieves, the family or whatever, right? And so they're stealing these cars and stripping them down and making dune buggies and doing credit card fraud and breaking into houses and all this kind of stuff. And they're doing, like Charlie told me, they're when they're at the ranch, they were doing all these robberies, and he likes fine art and paintings and stuff like this. So they'd be living in these shacks that should be condemned, and they'd have like, $200,000 worth of art hanging on the walls. Or he stole a bunch of, I want to say Angela Lansbury, but I might be wrong, but I think that's who it was. They broke into some Hollywood actress and stole a bunch of fur coats and glued them onto a dune buggy so it looked like a living animal, And he'd drive this thing around, and so he recalls those kind of days and events, pretty clearly, because that was the last time he was out. But I think there's so much chaos and so much disorder, and everyone was so messed up, and I honestly believe if you were to question every one of them, I don't think anybody really knows what happened. I think that's part of the fascination of the whole story.
Yeah, you do a good job of at least at stating that sort of argument, and without going into it too much, because really you could spend 400 pages on that. You really could, refuting what Bugliosi said. Of course, he's got to take something to the jury, and we got to think it's 1969 too, and just it's a hysteric time anyway. Full of hysteria, and they need to have some closure on this really quickly rather than later. And he becomes this, again, he spent most of his life in prison, so he's a pretty good scapegoat. But you portray him as somebody that again, just what you've described, he's not a mastermind. And so let's put that aside, and he fell into things, and that's what I wanted to get from this too, that you did speak to him about his philosophy. You even have a chapter called Polanski. So you do give him the freedom to make some comments, but I think for people who are listening to this, it is sort of if I'm not correct, maybe it is sort of a version of Eastern philosophy in a lot of ways. Lots of the stuff that he talks about. Now, how did you did eventually get around to visiting Charles Manson? So tell us a little bit how the circumstances that you had to go through to be able to do that.
Okay. Well, I again, like I didn't think that was going to happen, and the first time I attempted to get in, I was kind of stopped at the front desk, and they said my application was pending. I was waiting for my criminal check to go through, and this had been like after waiting for 8 months already, kind of thing. So it totally didn't look like it was going to happen, and I was directed to contact the warden in writing. And once I did that, all of a sudden, everything kind of turned around, and then I was approved. And even going in to meet him, I was told that, don't get your hopes up kind of thing. He often doesn't go to the visiting room. And I had known that he hadn't seen anybody in over a year at that point. He wasn't, and so I was a little skeptical if he would actually come out, kind of thing. But, yeah, it all kind of came together. So.
And what was it like? Describe the actual visit.
I'd been talking to him on the phone for a while, so it was kind of, we knew each other kind of thing, so it wasn't, like just walking into an empty room and being confronted with Charles Manson. I was kind of prepared for it, but as soon as you see the guy, it's a little intense. Like, even though he is 76 years old, he still has that kind of energy and aura about him, right? And when I was directed into the visiting room, he was already there, and he was setting up a table, and he had a chess table set out, a chess board, and I don't know how to play chess at all, so and I think I must have looked a little shocked or a little intense or whatever, because he tried to kind of put me at ease, and he's just speaking pleasantries and just being general, like, how was your trip and how you enjoy, how you like in California, kind of thing. And once we were kind of calmed down, and I was sitting, he stood up and he put the chair behind him, and then he started screaming as loud as he could, and he started he was doing this whole thing around a bank robbery, and she's like, saying, "Get down, I'll kill you," and as soon as he started, there's two guards in the center of the room, and it's like a kiosk kind of thing. And they were like totally ready to come over, and so I'm watching these guards and kind of watching what he's doing, and I'm thinking this is going to be the shortest visit ever. And he has a way of pushing things as far as he can, and he knows how to kind of back off when he needs to. And so once that whole scene plays out, he kind of, gathers himself and catches his breath and sits down, and he's kind of laughing to himself. And I'm like, what the hell was that, kind of thing. And so he told me that was level 7. And when I asked what's that mean, what does that mean? And he said that's his experience of living in constant fear but overriding it. And so he described it like if you were about to be in a car accident or something like that, how everything slows down and everything kind of falls into place and everything happens in the right way, and he said, that's kind of how he lives. He's always on edge. He's always has to be alert. And so
right.
He's always tried to explain his experience to me, and I think that kind of comes through in the book too.
So for people that I guess don't know it, at least it's there's a good possibility that people would kill him just by virtue of it can raise their status in jail. I don't know if people understand that, but now the thing is, you meet a couple of confidants of Charles Manson, Grey Wolf and Star, and tell us about your meetings with them. That's very interesting book as well, these meetings with these friends of Charles Manson.
Grey Wolf and Star are sort of, I guess, the main supporters or his best friends kind of thing, and they kind of watch out for him, and they kind of deal with the outside stuff that's happening. And with a guy like Charlie, it's, like last year was the 40th anniversary of the murders, and the prison got more than 2,000 media requests, and he gets at least 50 a week kind of thing, he gets thousands of letters, and there's a lot of stuff that, and a lot of people that, Charlie's lost touch with, and people he wants, there's all kinds of, so they take care of that end of things, just kind of trying to help out and correspond and try to get his word out kind of thing, around his environmental stance. And basically, to meet with Charlie, you kind of got to go through Grey Wolf, and I don't want it to sound like it's a process or anything, but I mean, he kind of watches out for Charlie on that level too, right, to make sure.
Sure.
Because like you mentioned earlier, a lot of people would want to kill him to, raise their status or whatever. And Charlie's been, he was telling me last night that he was in San Quentin, I believe, and he was having some problems with a guard or a warden out there, and they stripped him of his clothes and put him in a shower, handcuffed him completely nude, and put in 4 black guys, And so, like, he's been stabbed, he's been set on fire, he's been, absolutely everything that can possibly happen in a prison, he's gone through it, And so
right.
that's why he's in a protective housing unit right now,
Right. Now you feature a lot of artwork from Manson. It's, I guess, contemporary art, abstract art.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly a fair amount of his philosophy. You talk about his environmental philosophy. Okay, but I mean, there's a lot more about, like I say, maybe you can talk about the Polanski chapter and what he had to say about Polanski itself. Some people might be outraged at that, and obviously, everyone uses controversy a little bit to say, okay, here's a chapter about Polanski. What's he got to say? Sharon Tate was murdered, but what's he got to say? So tell our audience what is included in the Polanski chapter, and what does Charles Manson have to say about Polanski himself?
My publisher is out of Montreal, and they have a sister office in Paris, and Polanski's like a hero over there. He's so that's kind of why the whole Polanski focus. And I actually had a whole bunch of information that I didn't think was credible. I couldn't really prove the source or whatever. And there's so many different conspiracies and different angles. And Polanski I don't think he had any involvement at all. I mean, I think the guy, he was away trying to work and he lost his wife, and the whole thing is completely horrific. And at the time, Sharon was like a totally rising star, and she was 8 months pregnant and, totally beautiful. And, Jay Sebring was kind of like he's a hairdresser to the stars. His clientele was like absolutely everybody, you know. And so when that whole thing happened, it affected Hollywood on such a heavy level, you know. And I guess some of the things that I found out and that I talked about was that there's been these rumors and a lot of talks about these secret films and porn films that Polanski was involved with, and they involved like different celebrities and acts like you know, like basically almost child pornography and bestiality and all this kind of stuff, really weird kind of things. The weirdest thing about the whole environment was that all of these people knew each other, and Charlie told me that he was friends with Sharon Tate. He knew JC, he knew everybody, so that was his neighborhood. He knew all of those people, and to try and put everything together, I met a guy named John Ace Neal, who is kind of the authority on Charles Manson. He owns every, you know, piece of video footage, every, you know, photo. He's got these completely insane archives, and he's been following the story since like 1969. And so basically, Tex Watson was a hairdresser. That's what he did. That's what J.C. Bring did. Tex used to have like a wig store, and so they were acquaintances. They knew each other. They were friends. They used to go to the Tate house and, you know, use the swimming pool. You hang out, party, that kind of thing. So there's all these hippies, I guess convoluting is the word John used, with all these Hollywood, you know, people, or the Hollywood people would be slumming with the hippies or whatever. They'd be having sex, they'd be sharing drugs, and this happened everywhere. It was just kind of the way life was back then. And so basically what I'm told, again, I wasn't there, but this kind of adds up and this kind of makes sense as a different theory, or at least something to kind of look into, was Jay Sebring and Wojtek were basically trying to corner this whole MDA market. It was a new drug at the time, and nobody really had control over it. And so they were involved in some really big deal. And Tex Watson was a drug dealer. He has a history of ripping off a lot of people, a lot of bad deals. No one really trusted him. He was like basically a junkie. No one wanted him around. So apparently he shows up at the Tate house and he says, I want in on this. It just sounds like a good thing kind of thing. And they don't know how to deal with him. So Wojtek says, well, come back in an hour and we'll figure this out kind of thing. So Tex drives around for an hour. He comes back and he's like, okay, I'm back kind of thing. And they decided that they can't have anything to do with him. Like Wojtek and Sebring said, this guy's trouble. And so they tell him, get the hell out of here. We don't want nothing to do with you, man. We'll call the police. And so Tex is offended by this. He drives out to the ranch. And apparently he waits for Charlie, and because he's not around. And so Charlie shows up, and Tex says, they're ripping me off here. I'm supposed to be on this deal. What am I supposed to do? And Charlie may have said something like, "Do what you need to do," or "Shut up," or "Move on." I don't know what advice was given, but that's apparently where this command and this control, all of it.
Right.
That's kind of the event where, it's up to opinion almost what happens after that, right? But it sounds like more like a home invasion kind of thing, like that. I guess that's what they call it today. It was a botched drug deal.
Yeah, I see what you mean, and there's some credibility, there's some credence to what you're saying there because of especially Tex Watson doing principally doing the murders, and the thing is that certainly home invasion, but certainly things could have the scenario you have is less home invasion, but more of a drug deal and gone bad, and then go from there. But certainly that's
I
would
like to say. Yeah.
Pardon me?
Oh, I was just going to add that, and really, if Charlie knew that anything like this is going to happen, that people are going to be killed, and he did nothing to prevent it, then absolutely he's as guilty as everybody else, right? I mean,
right.
So, but I've talked. I just haven't had that sit down thing, like what really happened, kind of thing. So, and anything that he said that he talked about the murders or whatever, I've put into the book. So it's kind of.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because when we look back now from 1969, there was all those rumors of Satanism and ripping out the baby from the womb, which never happened, and so there was this big tie for Satanism, but at the same time, you would think, okay, well that's the media, but Bugliosi still weaved a certain tale of, like you say, mind control and Satanism and this. Yeah, I don't know if it's tenuous, but it certainly is an interesting motive because he wanted to create a race war. It sounds like how you described in the beginning, at least, that there's a certain amount of question of, well, no matter what he wanted to do, how mentally ill was he? But in the U.S., it's a little bit different in Canada, as you may know, being involved in the psychiatric industry. There's almost no one, even if they're bald-faced insane, gets off on an insanity plea in the U.S., so they seem to not really care regardless, and this is very politically motivated, and especially at that time, so they're not going to give the benefit of the doubt to a long-term offender like Charles Manson. So, but at least it's an interesting concept, for, again, like you said, one of the 50, the attention that he gets in prison to this day is incredible, and that's why the book is so popular. That's why Charles Manson is such a enigmatic personality. So now the thing is, how did your friendship evolve, and to the point where would you got his blessing from this book? I would trust. How did it, when you didn't originally intend to write a book, so when the idea came that you would like to write a book, how did you broach that subject with him? How did that conversation go down? What did he have to say, and did he give you his blessing?
Well, it goes. All of this is tied together with this final interview thing, right? That the state of California won't let happen. There's a law that it's specific that says you cannot interview certain inmates. Well, any specific inmate in the state of California. There's no way that he's ever going to be able to do this interview thing. And so, I think part of him agreeing to meet with me was that we needed to have, like a photo together kind of thing, just so we can go ahead and maybe, that would help get this interview to happen or whatever. But when I met with him, I told him, like, I don't think this is ever going to happen. Like, this is kind of what we're up against. There's this law, even though I'm from Canada, and he's insistent that they can't keep the world press out, kind of thing. And so when I started talking to him about doing a book, initially his response was, that's total bullshit. I want nothing to do with that kind of thing. And then it turned around to, if you write about yourself and your journey, write about it from you, then I'm okay with that. And then he said, if I was to use his words, he just said, don't mess with them at all. Just, keep them the way they are, and don't interpret them. Don't try to figure them out. Just put out the way it is, kind of thing. And so I tried to stay true to that, and because of that, he's trying to read through the book right now, actually. He just got a copy a couple of weeks ago, and it takes him a long time to read, and he just said he knows that what I had to work with, and basically that I did the best I can, and he's totally cool with everything, so.
Yeah, well, I think, anybody that got to present their own perspective on almost anything, obviously, like you say, you're not censoring anything, so, and you're not commenting on it, you're not attacking him. I wanted to ask you, because a lot of true crime authors, and it's even surprising which ones might have this attention, but some of them do, they get criticized for contacting and communicating, and often people say, well, who's going to profit from this, and you're re-victimizing the victims, and so I'm sure you got some criticism, but tell us if any criticism came your way because you decided to write this book and correspond with Charles Manson.
Yeah, I wanted to tell a story, and I think it's fascinating, and even from my own perspective, I really can't believe that everything that happened, and it came together the way it did, and the people I met shared so much, and there's kind of like 4 or 5 books that could have came out of this, and things could have went in so many different directions. And again, I think I was attracted to a different thing. I'm not really into true crime. I don't, like violence. I don't really subscribe to any of that. And so to me, our relationship is almost it's almost like a therapist client kind of relationship or something. And it's on his terms, right? He can, phone or he can't phone, or he won't or whatever. So it's, he could, last night could have been the last time I ever heard from him. You never know with this guy. Like he's kind of, things kind of go in completely the opposite direction. Like with money, he's allowed 4 packages a year, and I think the value is like $500 on a package. And so that would be stuff like vitamins and coffee and, just whatever, maybe a couple CDs, that kind of stuff. And you're only allowed to have a certain amount of money in your bank account, so he doesn't really care about, money, like that kind of stuff. And so it's from his end, there's no financial gain, and from me giving him nothing, there's no, none of that's happening. And I have to sell like a lot of money to break, or a lot of books to break even, on what I put into this project. So it wasn't about that. And I actually, this might be naive maybe, but I wanted to have a platform to speak about mental health and those concerns, and about prisons and that environment that people live in. And to me, I wouldn't say it's abusive, and a lot of people probably think Charlie's where he is and he agrees to get what he gets. And I'm sure if these crimes never happened, well, I shouldn't say I'm sure, but you're dealing with a guy who's basically been out of jail 4 times in his life, and he keeps going back for various crimes, right? He probably would have landed himself in there some way. But those conditions are pretty harsh, and there's so much mental illness in prisons, and I've worked in jails too. So I thought that was kind of why I did the book, is because I was caught up in something that was kind of overwhelming, and it was a crazy story, and it just kind of wrote itself. It was, yeah.
The thing is you do explain as well that at one point Charles Manson was set to be released from prison, and he said, "You can't let me out. I'm not ready. I can't handle it." Just to illustrate how dysfunctional he was, and how institutionalized he was, and how fragile he was, which lends credence to your argument that he got out and he had a little bit of philosophy here and a little bit of Scientology there, but he'd been institutionalized, and then all of a sudden he encountered this wonderful, time where he could philosophize and people would follow him and listen to him, and meanwhile he was just trying to get a record deal and get by, and so certainly not what he was portrayed as. So he's, so when he talks, he also talks about how the prison raised him, and how he didn't know any different, and he didn't know any other environment, and also psychologically, it's pretty evident that lots of the stuff he says is somewhat scattered and tangential, but at the same time, there's these glimmers of it's more than lucid, obviously a profoundness, I guess, from somebody that's sitting in this place for his whole life, and talking about that perspective, how he deals with it, and how he gets by, and how he has to look at things to survive, So it's, I think you've done a good job in pointing that out. I don't know, again, like you say, there's a couple more books in sort of analyzing everything you've learned from it, for sure.
Well, he's told me he's been in prison for 66 years, the majority of his life, and most of that time was in solitary confinement. And I think we live in an age where if you lose your internet for a day, or you lose your cell phone, you go mad, and I cannot imagine or believe how the hell and that's the kind of stuff I'm interested in. It's like if you're thrown in a cell, complete solitary, what do you do? And he showed me, during a visit, he's he taps all the time. He's kind of restless and fidgety, and he's got an incredible sense of rhythm and percussion, right? And so I asked him, how the hell do you learn that? And he said when he was in the hole in San Quentin, all he had was a sink and he had a combination sink toilet thing, and he would play them like bongos, and he's showing me how he would do this, and then he would pick up different rhythms, and he'd kind of go into a trance and almost like a meditation, and he would do this, and he was telling me when you're living like that, if an ant crawls across the floor, that's a whole other world, because now you have something to relate to. And so you watch this ant, and you can see how it could, what it can do, and so it's a whole. The guy's a whole, So there's that whole side of things, and then you have the side where he can be extremely perverse and vile, and just like holy shit, this guy, like completely out of control and ranting. And I think a lot of the phone calls, or a lot of it's the way he vents and deals with, that environment kind of thing. So, and he doesn't understand the whole fame thing, right? Like he just wants to be left alone. That's kind of what he tells me. But I mean, he lets me in his world, and I write a book, So it's like there's so much of this kind of stuff. It's got to be. I think it's overwhelming, And one observation, that was important for me to try and figure out was that environment and what his cell was like and what the people were like and what that daily routine and that structure kind of thing. And so when you're living like that, like he is kind of protected and it is a different world and things work and relate completely differently in there. And then when I was just recently I was watching some video stuff on YouTube or something, and I can't remember, there was one interview and I could tell that it was just the start, and he was kind of dancing around and doing all of this stuff, and it was like, man, like you pull him out of solitary confinement or whatever environment he's in, and at that time he was in full out restraints, to do interviews or anything, to have any contact. It was between glass kind of thing, and so all of a sudden you have a production crew in there, you have all these extra guards and people who want to see this interview happen, and like that's got to be overwhelming for anybody, like to be thrown into that. And so it's almost like falling into character or something or whatever role, and to it's a different. I can see a shift there where he has to, try and deal with that, and that's kind of the image that everyone sees. And to me, I see a guy who's completely uncomfortable with what he's trying to do. That's my take on that.
So you think that basically now he is a much different character, and at the time he filled the character that they wanted him to be for whatever reason, frustration or just, like you say, mental illness still, but certainly he's been straight for many, many years now, 40 years. So it's a different time, and he has a different perspective as well. Like you say, for all those years, it's every single relationship he had to wonder whether it was people who were using him, were going to write a book, or what perspective they were going to. But people wanted a piece of him, and that was it. People followed him, people want a piece of him. But so you're saying that he basically, you understand that he performed at that time, and he certainly really doesn't want to do that now for the cameras and for the media.
Well, it just seems like a performance, and I think. Once he kind of gets adjusted to whatever that environment is, he does fine, and you can see other. I think that's kind of how they highlight most of the interviews, is kind of the crazy stuff, right? And so that for a long time and a lot of years was my imagery of Charlie. Okay, there he is, a crazy guy, and that's complete madness, and that's as crazy as it gets. And then you go past that, you go into that, and we've had these talks about madness and that kind of stuff, and when you get into like the way he deals with things, and to me, I do see him as a survivor, and he does try to express and explain himself. It's a whole other thing, it's a totally different person, and I could even see that shift like in our early phone calls until when I got to know him. There's kind of a point where he kind of opens up and he's more honest and truthful about things. So I don't think he's like that. He's more candid, I guess that would be the word.
Right. I've found really fascinating too is the photo that you provide in your book of, well, they say potentially through your research and everyone and this person's research, he could have been the son of Charles Manson. And when you see the photo, it's very, very, very convincing. Yeah. Just the look. I mean, it's the features are there. That's all. It's not just a slight photo thing and talk yourself into it. So, tell us a little bit about that discovery. Yeah. Matthew Roberts is a guy who just kind of came, who I ended up meeting through another character in the book, Stanton LaVey, and
Matthew is a musician in L.A., and his story is pretty unbelievable. And he's adopted, and when he searched out his birth mother, he got information that said she was a part of, the Manson family, or a part of those happenings, orgies, and whatever kind of madness was going on at the time. And she believed that Charles Manson was, Matthew's father. And there is a striking resemblance. There's a whole lot of stuff that, there's some mannerisms and stuff that Matthew has that are really, really weird. And when I first met him, I didn't think, I kind of seen a little bit of a resemblance, but, it was, kind of, okay, I can see it. But when I met Charlie, then I really saw how Matthew remembered him, resembled him kind of thing. Mm. And so what happened with Matthew was he was trying to figure out if Charlie was his dad, and he was proceeding, trying to go through all the channels to do the DNA thing, and he's trying to, have this relationship with Charles Manson, and he found the whole thing frustrating, and he was in a bar in L.A. and a little drunk, and he ended up talking to somebody and giving an interview, and that interview ended up getting picked up by the Globe, I believe, and it got like 200 million hits over Thanksgiving weekend a couple of years ago. So once he went public, basically, which is what happened, and things have been pretty strained with him and Charlie.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Because he went public, you're saying? Yeah.
I mean, basically, people think that he's trying to cash in and promote his band and trying to be famous or whatever. But I talk to Matthew all the time, and he's very sincere about everything. He's a really good guy, and he's got the best intentions and stuff. And it's extremely stressful. Can you imagine if just what he's dealing with? If you put yourself in his shoes. So
do you ever get in between in the conversation, trying to broker some kind of situation between the two? I mean, you're intimate with both of them.
Yeah, I've tried that. I've but basically it's kind of up to Matthew and Charlie. They're aware of each other, and they're going to correspond the way they do, and it's kind of up to Charlie to see how he wants to follow through with everything.
I see. How long
and
has
I
it been
think
since
they... Sorry?
How long has it been since they've tried to correspond? Is this a recent?
I think almost 2 years now. Yeah.
Yeah,
since that article, that story broke. And then when something like that happens, like Details magazine did a piece, and Matthew thought, whatever, I've already done a story, and so he did it. He did this interview. They send out a bunch of legal papers saying, we need your DNA, and we're trying to prove that, all this kind of stuff. And Matthew had no knowledge of any of that. So that kind of stuff happens all the time, and then you get all these. It's amazing, even from my perspective, I get a lot of people who want me to try and get them in to meet with Charlie, or try to forward a message, or a lot of authors I'll get messages from saying, can you find out who, at whatever reform school, who was the dean over who was who was his grade 3 teacher, what is the significance of this song? It's just bizarre what people are interested in, Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about because obviously we talked a little bit about how Bugliosi kind of put this, not Satanism thing, but the media caught up in that. The projection of Manson was this cult leader, satanic cult leader, and there was all these rumors, and the media played up on that as well, and people's public perception of, children being ripped out of the womb. But you did have a real encounter with Satanists, and that was LaVey. So tell us about that and why that was important. And again, for I think some people, I don't think they'll buy your book and be critical, but I think people that wouldn't bother to read your book might be critical when you have these, you're contacting people that are selling Manson memorabilia. That would outrage certain people. Yeah. You explain that, but again, that comes from the book. You can explain yourself well, but tell us a little bit about the Satanism connection in this.
And that I've gotten actually more emails about than anything else, in a negative sense. It's why did you focus so much on that? And it wasn't a focus. I mean, everybody just seemed to be a Satanist. With Stanton LaVey, I have a band, and we were working on our second record, and he happened to be married to this fetish model named Zandora, and at the time she was like, one of the top models in the world. She had such an amazing look, and she was perfect for our band, and we contacted her to see if she could do our album cover, and she was going to do it, and everything was really cool, and we got invited to their wedding, and they got married on June 6th, 06, and it was like a big event. They had like Alkaline Trio played, I believe Hank 3 played, Danzig. There were a couple bigger metal bands, and it was like a pretty big thing. And Stanton used to be roommates with Marilyn Manson. He had a store in Hollywood, so he's kind of a scenester. He knows all of those people. That's kind of where he's from, kind of thing. They eventually got divorced, and all kinds of stuff happened with Stanton. But I remembered I had met him a few years ago before I knew anything about Charlie and any of this was kind of going, and he had talked a lot about how Charles Manson was a huge influence on his life, and how he had been exposed to that at the age of like 6 or something, since early childhood, and he believed that Charlie was the light bearer in the Luciferian order. He has a huge part in Satanism and is kind of a key central figure in bringing about the end of the world. And he totally believes this. Like, this is completely his truth. And the way he laid out his story, I wanted to use the exact transcripts from beginning to end, but you kind of got to make it a book. Otherwise, it's just transcripts, I guess. But it was very thrilling and probably very controversial what he's talking about. But that's kind of where he's coming from. I mean, his grandfather founded the Church of Satan, wrote the Satanic Bible. He was born into that. That's kind of what he is.
It's interesting too, because Polanski, for those people that don't know, has worked on what was the Ninth Gate and all kind. I mean, vampire movies, and so for those people who are looking for connections, I mean, it was very coincidental, very odd, the kinds of movies that he has worked on. And then, like you say, the recent rape charges that surfaced again in his extradition hearings, and like you say, the French sort of protecting him and saying no, and Americans wanting him to go to trial for this, basically assaulting a minor, basically in the U.S. So it's interesting how all these things get mixed up. The legitimate Hollywood, but there's Satanism there, and then you're in contact with people, and then everybody's an environmentalist. So it's very fascinating, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's a completely bizarre cast of characters, and they're all intertwined, and there are so many connections between everybody. And the way Stanton speaks, I could almost find direct quotes from Charlie, saying the exact same thing, the way Matthew talks. There's a lot of parallels, and there's a lot of connections, and even while doing all of this is kind of overwhelming, that all of that kind of stuff. And what I tried to do is put together, like, all of these people are influenced like directly by Charlie for one way or another, whether it be through his environmental stance or his fame or his beliefs, whatever it is, and to try and to tie all that together to try and get a kind of an image of who he really is.
Yeah, well, I think you've done a good job. It's a totally different side, and it is obviously a much, much more personal side than you're going to get from anything I've read. But then again, the only thing I've ever read is Helter Skelter, and so I mean, I'm sure there have been some books, but I think you're onto something, because I haven't seen too many, and I think that this is a totally different perspective. Now, you had spoken earlier about how you use a different term too, that your mother completed suicide when you were young, and you did have a couple friends that succumbed to cancer as well. So you had your fair share of trauma. You did gravitate towards the psychiatric industry because of your interest, and also obviously your compassion, because that's what you do, and you have to be compassionate and understanding with these kind of people. How did this, if at all, how did this help you? Reaching out to Charles Manson and going through this whole journey, how on earth could this have helped you?
You know, like 5 years ago, if someone told me I'd be doing this, or I'd let a guy like Charles Manson have my phone number, I think they were right nuts. You know, never in a million years. And
Sure.
I just went through a period of time where, you know, like 2 of my best friends died. I got dumped from a 4-year relationship. Happy Valentine's Day, by the way. I went to Europe. You know, you go to Europe to find yourself, a lot of people say, and I ended up hanging out with all these Advaita teachers, which is like, it's not really a belief system. It'd be like an ultimate philosophy, kind of like presence or oneness, or, you know, the whole now thing, you know, that kind of approach to life. And these guys are intense. And so I did that for like 3 weeks. And then I come back, and like, you know, literally a week after being back from Europe, I get a call from Charles Manson, and I think the message I got was like, okay, you know, here I am feeling sorry for myself, and look at this guy, kind of thing. You know, I couldn't compare to that. And you know, he would never. I don't think teacher is the right word, but it's kind of humbling. And I think this whole experience, like, okay. When I met with Charlie, one of the first questions I had to ask him was like, you know, he caught me staring at the swastika on his head, and it's like, okay, you know, what's that about, kind of thing. And he said that, you know, he picked that up because it was the most hated symbol in the world, and at the time he was the most hated guy, and he was looking at death row, and he was getting spit on every day, and people wanted to fight him, and, you know, he just wanted to give up on life, kind of thing. And so he identified with the swastika, and then once he started learning what that symbol meant, you know, it's you know, and I know in Cree it's the spinning wheel, and in Japan I believe it's number 500 or whatever, and like every culture has esoterically used that symbol for something, but what Germany did with it is, you know, made it what it's remembered for, kind of thing. And so,
sure,
you know, I've always had this idea of doing this book, and I wanted to do it around depression, and I wanted to do it, you know, I was journaling my experience and everything, and all of a sudden I put my name on the same cover as Charles Manson, like probably career suicide, you know.
Yeah.
And then when you do something like this, writing's kind of a solitary thing, and so that wasn't really that big of a thing, you know. And when the book was getting ready to come out, like a lot of my colleagues and coworkers, they, you know, very few of them knew about my association with Charles Manson. None of them knew about my childhood and, you know, my upbringing. I come out of a dysfunctional home or whatever, and so throwing all of that out, and I had to talk to family members, and, you know, I had to let my employer know that, okay, this is what I'm doing. You know, I got this book coming out. It's going to get a lot of attention, you know, and I'm kind of extremely, I guess, grateful that people understand the message, and it's really hard to talk about when people don't read the book, because basically they try to make you, they say, oh, you're friends with Charles Manson, and they try to make you into this, you know, monster, and then direct anger and hostility towards that. But that was never my intent, was to do anything hurtful to anybody or anything. I don't know if I'm just rambling here, but that's kind of how it all came about. It was really bizarre, and I'm questioning with that ethic all the time. And even like just talking with you, like things come up, like, you know, I'm just, even though the book's out, I'm still not sure if it was the right thing to do. You know, I still.
Well, you know, the thing is, I got to say that, you know, from a person like me, that you know, I've written a book, and I understand being criticized for various, you know, for various certain aspects of it. You know, you write if it's a controversial crime, then somehow your association, and not everybody articulates it, but, you know, there's a certain refusal for some people to take you seriously with the book. It's just uncertain what it is, but I think that you've had some people that got the message, and I think they took the time to do that. So, but I think when people hear it's Charles Manson, and then you are writing a book about Charles Manson, you're going to include his artwork. If you just did a cursory look at your book, you might think it's an endorsement. And I think you might think it's an endorsement if you just don't read it. If you read it, then you understand that everybody has, you know, when you talk to the memorabilia guy, and you say, well, how on earth could you do this? Well, you know what? He defends himself admirably. You know, I mean, and if you thought, well, can a guy defend himself? I'd be the first guy, even though I'm open-minded, to say, well, I'd like to hear this one. Well, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but your book, you do a good job of doing that. And I'm not going to say that, and you don't say either, hey, Charles Manson's a hero or he's wrongfully convicted, but, you know, let's just look at the person, and I think you've done a great dissection of, here is the guy, here's how he lives, here's some of his philosophies, here's how he survives, here's what I got out of it, and you really don't indict anybody else's perspective on this, but you just, again, do a great, incredible job of articulating what might have happened amid all the hysteria now that we look at it 40 years later. You know, so you've done a great job.
Thank you.
And so I think in terms of you had the right instincts, that's why you've got a great product. Nobody gets basically published unless people believe in what you're doing. So, you know, I mean, there's always going to be people that criticize, but obviously those are the people that don't even bother to read the book, so you can't pay too much attention to those people, can you?
No, and I've been getting a lot of mail from, like, people who want to become psych nurses and are interested in psychiatry, and that's really cool. A lot of musicians and stuff, and a lot of people who, you know, find my story. I just feel weird talking about myself, but they find it courageous and inspiring. Those are a couple of the words I've heard, and it's given them a platform to speak from, or to deal with family problems, or to bring stuff out, and that is way more than I ever expected. And to me, like, I know how the world sees Charles Manson, but he to me he's like a guy I would meet at Salvation Army, or a transient guy, you know, I'd meet at a shelter or downtown or in jail or whatever. Like I kind of relate to him on that level, you know. But I do know, how, I guess famous is the word you could use, and I do know how big his influence is, and I do know how people interpret everything the guy does, and that's more fascinating than the character, than Charles Manson. You know, it's what happens around him. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's amazing when you see this portrayal of evil, and regardless. I mean, because like I say, I just wrote a book, and this person, you know, maybe was evil, but you know what? That's part of this whole thing. When you sit and talk with these people, no matter how, even if they did do heinous things, or were complicit, or there, or should have known, or whatever it is, it's amazing how you can get sucked into their vulnerability and their humanity. And you know, I'm not saying that you bring them home or anything, but in terms of the humanity of everybody, and jail does a great job of putting people in a completely different light. And when you talk to them, I think that you may have even found it incredible that, like you say, that this guy was even accused of this stuff. Really,
well, this guy, he's, you know, I think you used the word institutionalized, but he can read people better than anyone I've ever met. He knows exactly. And so then you start thinking, well, what did he read on me? And maybe, you know, part of him wanted this book to happen the way it happened, but he, you know, like how much. Yeah. So you get into all that kind of, you know, psychology kind of stuff. But I mean, and to survive the way he has, he can't be stupid. I mean, there's no way. There's a definite a total will to. I don't know anybody who's got more of a will to survive than that guy. And to do it, you know, in those conditions and stuff, it's pretty amazing, pretty remarkable.
It was interesting, too. I saw a program a few years ago, and I'd always heard that there was this musical aspect to this story where he, you know, had auditioned for record company guys or agents or something. And then I heard actually the music that he had done, and I went, you know, I thought that he'd be a bum musically, but he really wasn't. He really was. He was, you know, I don't know if you could say, oh, yeah, this was the next big thing, but he definitely was competitive. He definitely he was a good singer. You know, I mean, in terms of there was some legitimacy to that too. So it's very interesting too, and I think as a musician myself too, that's interesting to me as well. That really was lost in the stories originally. That was downplayed incredibly. You heard about Wilson, Miss Wilson, I think it was, but not much. You know, it's interesting to hear how complex this story really is, and you go into some other aspects of of other unsolved murders as well too that were on the Spahn Ranch, and so I'll let people read that for themselves. It's a fascinating. I mean, it's just his legacy lives on. It's incredible, incredible story.
Absolutely.
Anyway, I wanted to also put a little plug in for your band as well. I know that you're a serious musician. So, what is the name of your band?
Well, see, that was when things went to shit. A couple of years ago, we totally fell apart during the recording of our second record. I got vocals down for 8 songs and 4 more to go, and lost my voice. And we're actually, I'm getting together with the drummer next week for the first time in 3 or 4 years, and we're going to start playing again. So our band's called Plastic Bastard. So I think we have a MySpace page, so there's some stuff up on there. But that's been that's the best sanity in the world, the best therapy. Music's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, our time is up, but I wanted to really thank you very much for the book itself. It was a fantastic read, and thank you for coming on and being so articulate about your book, Charles Manson Now. I want to thank you very much for appearing on the program, and the best of luck with this book, by the way, Marlin. Okay, so I want to thank you very much. Thank you for appearing on the program, and have yourself a good Valentine's Day.
You too, Dan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, with my special guest, Marlin Marynick, with his book, Charles Manson Now. See you next time. Good evening.